Across the farmland that feeds this country, something quiet and strange is happening. Farmers, researchers, and entire farming communities are rehearsing. They are running experiments, changing crops, capping their own wells, and rebuilding how they grow food, all in preparation for a single event that they have decided is no longer a question of if, but when. A future in which the groundwater beneath them is effectively gone. You do not rehearse for something that might happen. You rehearse for something you are sure is coming. And that is what makes this so unsettling. The people who know the land best, who have the most to lose, who have every reason in the world to believe that tomorrow will look like yesterday, are the ones quietly acting as if the water under their fields is running out. Not panicking, not protesting. Practicing. But here is what almost no one steps back to see. Each of these clever adaptations, taken on its own, gets reported as good news. A smart new irrigation system, a hardy new crop, a conservation program that saved water and kept profits up. And they are real, and some of them are genuinely impressive. But line them all up together, and they stop looking like a collection of bright ideas. They start looking like what they actually are, a civilization drawing up its evacuation plan from a resource it cannot live without, one field trial at a time. So the real question is not whether American agriculture can adapt to less groundwater. It is already trying in a dozen different ways. The question is what it means that the people who grow our food have quietly concluded they need to practice for its disappearance, and whether all that practicing can actually save them or only slow the fall. Picture a scene that is playing out, in one form or another, all across the dry farm country. A farmer stands at the edge of a field in the late summer heat, and in front of him are two strips of the same crop, planted side by side. One strip was watered the old way, the way his father and his grandfather did it, all the water the plants could want. The other was grown on a strict fraction of that, a deliberate experiment in how little he can give it and still bring in a harvest. He walks the rows, checking the plants on the thirsty side against the plants on the pampered side, and he is not doing this out of curiosity. He is doing it because he already knows that in a few years, the well that feeds this field will not be able to give the pampered side what it wants. He is measuring, right now, how badly it will hurt when that day comes. He is standing in his own field, quietly timing the arrival of a future he cannot stop. Multiply that farmer by tens of thousands across every dry growing region in the country, each one running some version of the same private drill, and you begin to see the real shape of what is happening. This is not a handful of researchers in a lab worrying about a distant problem. It is the working knowledge of an entire industry expressed field by field that the water is going, and that the time to learn how to live without it is now, while there is still enough left to practice with. Let me start with the place where the practicing is most honest, because they are doing the one thing almost no one ever volunteers to do. Out in western Kansas, farmers sit on top of one of the great underground water reserves on Earth, the aquifer that turned the dry high plains into a machine for growing corn and feeding cattle. And for decades, the deal was simple. Pump as much as you want. Grow as much as you can. The water seemed endless, except it was not. And the people out there have watched their own wells weaken year after year, watched the water table sink, and done the math on how many years of pumping they have left. In some areas, the answer is measured in a couple of decades, not centuries. So groups of them did something extraordinary. They voluntarily agreed to pump less, not because a distant government forced them, but because they sat down together as neighbors and set hard limits on their own water use, binding themselves to cut back by significant amounts over a set number of years. It was a wager, and a frightening one, that they could grow nearly as much food with meaningfully less water, and stretch the life of the aquifer out longer for their children. And the early results have been genuinely striking. Many of them cut their water use substantially and kept their profits nearly intact, by being more precise, by easing off the crops that drink the most, by refusing to waste a drop. It sounds like a triumph, and in a way it is. But sit with what it actually is. It is a group of farmers rationing themselves, on purpose, because they can see the end of the water coming, and they are trying to walk toward it slowly instead of running off the cliff. They are not planning for abundance. They are practicing for scarcity, and doing it with their eyes open. That honesty is admirable. It is also an alarm. To understand why they and so many others are rehearsing like this, you have to understand how completely modern American farming was built on groundwater in the first place. Agriculture uses, the vast majority of the water people draw from the environment, far more than every city and home combined. And a huge share of the most valuable, most reliable farmland in the country does not run on rainfall. It runs on irrigation, and a great deal of that irrigation comes from pumping water out of the ground. Groundwater is what let farmers stop gambling on the weather. It is what turned semi-arid plains and desert valleys into dependable, high-yield cropland, because you no longer had to pray for rain when you could simply pump certainty up out of the earth. That is the foundation the modern food system was poured on top of. And that foundation is being pulled out from under it. In region after region, that underground water is being withdrawn far faster than nature can ever replace it, drawn down toward a floor that people farming today will live to reach. So the future without groundwater is not a fantasy. It is a destination the current path leads to. And everyone paying attention can see it on the horizon, which is exactly why the practicing has started. When you can see the bridge is out ahead, you begin, whether you admit it or not, to plan for the moment you reach it. And it is worth being honest about how everyone ended up here, because the draining of the aquifers was not an accident or a simple failure of willpower. It was in many ways encouraged. For decades, the whole system was built to reward pumping. Cheap energy made it affordable to lift huge volumes of water from ever greater depths. Farm policy and crop subsidies pushed growers toward exactly the thirsty, high-value crops that demanded the most irrigation, because that was where the money and the support were. Crop insurance softened the risk of planting them. And the water itself, the most precious thing in the entire equation, was treated as nearly free, available to whoever owned the land and could afford the pump, with little accounting for how much was left. Every incentive pointed the same way. Pump more, plant more, grow more, now. A farmer who chose restraint simply earned less than the neighbor who did not, and watched that neighbor pump the shared water anyway. So the aquifers were not drained by villains. They were drained by ordinary people responding rationally to a system that paid them to drain them, over generations until the bill finally came due. And that is why the practicing feels so wrenching now. It is not just learning new techniques. It is unlearning a century of incentives that all said the water would never run out, and rebuilding farming around the opposite assumption that it will. The first and oldest rehearsal is a retreat, a return to the way things were done before the pumps, and it means growing less. Before the great aquifers were tapped, the dry parts of this country were farmed on rain alone. It was called dryland farming, and it meant humble crops, wheat and sorghum and the like, grown at the mercy of the sky, with modest yields and a lot of risk. Irrigation replaced all of that with lush, thirsty, high-value crops and harvests that dryland farmers of the past could only dream of. Now, in the places where the water is failing, farmers are being pushed back the other way, converting irrigated fields back to dryland farming, trading the corn that needs constant water for hardier crops that can survive on rainfall, accepting far lower yields and far lower income as the price of staying on the land at all. From above, you can watch it happen, the green irrigated circles of center pivot fields fading back to the pale patchwork of dry farming. It is a retreat measured in millions of acres, a slow undoing of the irrigation revolution. And it is a rehearsal for a future where the pump is simply not an option anymore. This is what farming without groundwater looks like at its most basic. It looks like growing less and earning less, and hoping the rain is kind. The second rehearsal is subtler. Instead of changing how they water the crop, farmers are changing the crop itself, breeding and choosing plants that simply need less. If the water is going to run short, one answer is to grow things that were built for drought in the first place. So across the dry farm belt, there is a quiet shift toward crops that can take the heat and survive on far less water. Ancient grains like sorghum and millet that shrug off dry spells in the deserts of the Southwest. Real experiments with crops like agave, the tough succulent behind tequila, which can thrive on almost no irrigation in exactly the kind of hot, dry conditions that are killing thirstier plants. There is a revival of dry farming for certain high-value crops. Wine grapes and tomatoes grown deliberately without irrigation, forcing the vines and plants to send roots deep and survive on what the soil holds, producing less but needing almost nothing from a well. And in laboratories, plant breeders race to develop new drought-tolerant varieties of the staple crops, plants engineered to make a harvest out of less moisture than their parents ever could. Every one of these is a way of taking the thirst out of the field, and every one of them is a concession, an admission that the era of growing whatever is most profitable and simply pumping whatever water it demands is ending. The third rehearsal is about precision, about wringing every possible bit of food out of every drop that is left. For a long time, irrigation was staggeringly wasteful. Water sprayed into the hot air to evaporate before it ever reached the roots, or flooded across fields where much of it simply ran off or sank away unused. So a whole industry has grown up around doing more with less. Drip irrigation, which delivers water in precise drops directly to the base of each plant, cutting waste dramatically, buried lines that water the roots from below, so nothing is lost to the sun. Soil moisture sensors and satellite data and software that tell a farmer exactly how much water each part of a field needs on a given day, so that not one extra gallon gets pumped. There is even the deliberate practice of what is called deficit irrigation, intentionally giving a crop slightly less water than it would ideally want, having learned the exact point where you can save a lot of water while losing only a little yield. All of this is real progress, and it genuinely stretches the supply. But notice the direction of it. Every innovation is aimed at surviving on less, at extracting the maximum from a shrinking resource. This is not the engineering of abundance. It is the engineering of rationing, dressed in the language of efficiency. The fourth rehearsal is the most hopeful, and it is an attempt to actually put water back, to practice refilling the account instead of only draining it. In the wet years, when the rains and the snowmelt come heavy and the rivers run high, that water has historically just rushed away, out to sea or downstream, doing nothing for the aquifer. So farmers and water agencies have begun, deliberately, to capture it and sink it back into the ground. They flood their own fields on purpose in the wet season, spreading the excess water across the land and letting it soak down through the soil to recharge the aquifer below, banking it underground for the dry years to come. They build basins and use old riverbeds to slow the water and give it time to seep back down. It is a genuinely clever idea, working with the natural plumbing of the land to save for the future instead of spending everything now. But even this hopeful practice carries the same hidden message. You do not go to the trouble of manually refilling an underground reservoir unless you know deep down that you are emptying it faster than nature can. Recharge is not a sign that the system is healthy. It is a sign that people have realized it is sick and are trying to run a transfusion. And in most places, the amount that can be banked this way is far less than the amount being pumped out. The fifth rehearsal is the hardest to talk about because it is not about a new technique. It is about learning to live inside a fixed limit forever. In the places where the reckoning has arrived, farming is being turned into something it has never been in the modern era, a budgeted activity. Instead of pumping whatever a crop demands, farmers are being handed a fixed allowance of water, a hard cap for the year, and told to make it work. Some regions have gone further and created markets where that water allowance can be bought and sold, so a farmer can decide whether it is more valuable to grow a crop with his share or to sell it to someone else and leave his own fields idle. It sounds orderly, even fair. But what it really represents is the end of the assumption that has underpinned farming for generations, that the water would always be there when you needed it. Learning to farm within a permanent, shrinking budget is the ultimate rehearsal for a future without groundwater, because it treats the water as what it has quietly become, a finite ration to be managed, argued over, and eventually run down, rather than a birthright pumped up freely from the earth. And the sixth rehearsal is the one nobody wants to name, because it is not adaptation at all. It is surrender, dressed up as strategy. Some of the land, everyone now quietly understands, is not going to be farmed at all. There is simply not enough water to keep it in production, and no clever technique will change that. So the practice becomes managing the retreat, deliberately taking land out of farming, retiring acres, and figuring out what to do with the ground that agriculture is giving up. In some places, that fallowed farmland is being covered in solar panels, the fields that once grew food now harvesting sunlight instead, because at least that requires no water. Programs pay farmers to idle their land. Planners talk carefully about which areas can be saved and which will have to be let go. It is all very reasonable, very managed. But strip away the language, and it is a controlled withdrawal, a farming region deciding in advance which parts of itself to abandon, so that the collapse when it comes is orderly rather than chaotic. You do not plan the retreat of an army that expects to win. You plan the retreat of one that knows it is losing ground it cannot hold. Now step back and look at all 6 rehearsals together, because this is where the real message lives. Growing less, changing the crops, squeezing every drop, refilling the bank, farming within a fixed ration, retreating from the land entirely. Each one is sensible. Each one buys time. And every single one of them is built on the same underlying assumption, that the groundwater is going away, and that the smart move is to prepare for its absence rather than to expect its return. That is the quiet consensus hiding underneath all the innovation. The people who feed this country are not betting on the water coming back. They are betting on it running out and organizing their entire future around that bet. And here's the hard truth that ties it all together. For all their cleverness, most of these practices do not actually solve the problem. They slow it. A farmer who cuts his pumping by a fifth is still pumping, still drawing the aquifer down, just more slowly. A field that switches to a drought-tolerant crop still needs some water in the dry years. Recharge banks back a fraction of what is taken out. These are not cures. They are ways of managing a decline, of stretching the remaining water over more years so the end arrives later and more gently. In a few remarkable places, the conservation is aggressive enough to come close to true balance. But across most of the great aquifers, the practicing is not stopping the fall, it is only teaching everyone how to live gracefully on the way down. And do not comfort yourself with the idea that if American fields fail, the food will simply come from somewhere else. Because the same rehearsal is running in the great bread baskets all over the world, and most of them are further along than we are. The enormous farming regions of northern India and northern China lean on groundwater so heavily that their water tables are among the fastest falling on the planet, propping up the diets of well over 1 billion people on reserves being spent at a terrifying rate. Parts of the Middle East gambled on pumping ancient desert aquifers to grow their own grain, drained them within a generation, and gave the effort up. Nation after nation is drawing down the same underground savings to feed itself, which means there is no untapped continent sitting in reserve, no vast wet farmland waiting to take over when ours run short. Everyone is practicing for the same future at the same time, and everyone is quietly counting on being able to buy food from someone else when their own wells fail. They cannot all be right. When the whole world is spending down the same kind of account, the comforting assumption that the shortfall can always be imported from elsewhere is not a plan. It is a game of musical chairs that the entire planet is playing at once. So what does a future without groundwater actually mean, once all the rehearsals are done and the real thing arrives? It means a smaller farm belt, less land in production, growing less food, in a country and a world with more people to feed than ever before. It means the end of cheap, limitless produce grown in what used to be desert, and a food system that has to source more of what we eat from farther away, from other regions and other countries running down their own water just as fast. It means higher prices at the grocery store, felt hardest by the people who can least afford it. It means farm towns that shrink and empty as the water that sustained them disappears. And it means a strange kind of vulnerability for a nation that has always taken its own overflowing abundance for granted. A slow realization that the ability to feed ourselves was built on an underground inheritance we were spending all along without ever really counting it. It also means a landscape that looks different from the one we grew up with. The endless green circles of irrigated crops that carpet the dry interior, so vast you can see them from an airplane window, are a very recent invention. Only a few generations old, and a future without groundwater erases a great many of them. In their place comes a patchwork of dry land fields, idled ground, solar panels, and scrub. A countryside that produces less and asks less of the earth beneath it, because the earth beneath it has less left to give. The abundance that felt permanent, the overflowing grocery shelves and the cheap calories, was in part a temporary condition, borrowed against water that was never going to last. And the generation alive now is the one that gets to watch the loan get called in. And underneath all the technique and all the policy, there is a human weight to this that rarely makes it into the reports. For the families who have farmed the same ground for generations, this practicing is not an abstract exercise. It is a slow renegotiation of everything they thought they would pass down. A farmer who learned the land from his father now has to teach his own children a different craft entirely. How to grow less, on more marginal water, with the quiet understanding that the farm they inherit may not be the farm he inherited. Some of those children are choosing not to take it on at all, looking at the numbers in the shrinking wells, and deciding their future is somewhere else. And so the knowledge and the attachment to a particular piece of earth, built over 100 years, begins to thin out. There is grief in this that the efficiency statistics never capture. To practice for a future without groundwater is also to practice for a future in which a way of life and a relationship between a family and a place may not survive. That is the real thing being rationed out there. Not just water. Continuity. The farmers of western Kansas capped their own wells and cut their own water because they looked honestly at the ground beneath them and chose to face what most of us would rather not think about, They are, in the best sense, ahead of the rest of us, rehearsing calmly for a future the whole country is walking toward. And the wet years will still come, and the rivers will run full for a season, and the reservoirs will rise, and it will be easy once again to believe the crisis was overblown. But the water table under the fields will keep sinking a little further each dry stretch. The clever new systems will keep spreading, not because farming is thriving, but because it has to. More acres will go quiet. More crops will change. More wells will be capped or abandoned. American agriculture is not wondering whether the groundwater will run out. It has already made up its mind. It is practicing for the day it does. Out in the fields, right now, in plain sight, and the only thing left to find out is whether all that practice is preparation for a future it can survive, or just a slow, careful rehearsal for goodbye.